I'm Glenn Campbell. I call myself a demographic philosopher. I'm looking at life and trying to predict the future through the lens of demography, or the study of human populations. And today I want to talk about social complexity. So today we live in a very complicated world. There are a lot of rules and regulations. There's a lot of complicated structures. There's a lot of technology, which depends on other technology. If you compare our lives today to the lives of people, let's say, 200 years ago, well, the situation is obviously more complex, more complicated. You can measure complexity in various ways. One of them is to look at all the laws that you're governed by in a certain country. And laws are all encoded in paper on books, and these books are printed by the government to fix these laws in place. So even today, you go into a law library to see what the actual law is, what the federal code is, and what the state code is, and what the various regulations are. And if you go into a law library today, you're going to find hundreds and hundreds of volumes of laws. If you went into the same library 50 years ago, you'd only find a fraction of those number of books, because laws are cumulative. They just kind of build upon each other. And this is good in one sense, that every law is created for a purpose. It's created to solve a problem. At the same time, the sheer volume of these laws makes it difficult for society to get things done. And this complication is something that accumulates in a society over time. Things never really get simpler. They always get more complicated. And eventually this leads to the collapse of a society. And my ideas in this regard are based on the writings of Joseph Tainter, an anthropology professor in Utah, whose field is the collapse of ancient civilizations. And he attributes much of this collapse to the accumulation of complexity within the society, which eventually kills the society, makes the society unsustainable over time. So what is complexity? Complexity is the creation of new systems to solve problems. And Joseph Tainter is looking back at, let's say, the fall of the Roman Empire. Why did the Roman Empire fall? Well, there's a lot of different theories about that, but you can't deny that the Roman Empire was getting more and more complex over time. To maintain this empire, it had more and more complex structures. Everything initially was run from Rome. Eventually, the Roman Empire was broken up into sub-districts, and each of those sub-districts had to have their own bureaucracy. And eventually, Tainter argues this made the Roman Empire just so expensive that it had to collapse one way or the other. Eventually, it was barbarians that brought down Rome, but the cost of regulation may have weakened the society to such a point where the barbarians could gain a foothold. So what does this mean for our society? Our society is getting more and more complex all the time. And complexity only works in one direction. Things only get more complex. They don't get simpler. So let's boil this down to something practical and demographic. People aren't having babies these days, in part because babies are so damn expensive. So the question is, what is it that makes babies more expensive than they used to be? And part of that is the growing body of regulation that you as a parent have to obey. Regulations and customs and conventions that you have to obey if you're going to raise children. For example, let's say back in the 1950s and 60s, people had big families. And how did they transport these families? Well, they had an ordinary car. They had a sedan, and they just piled all the kids into the back seat. So if you had 4 kids, you could just pile them all into the back seat, and mom and dad would sit in the front, and you could go drive someplace. Now, this was very dangerous because with a lot of kids packed into a car without proper seat belts, there were a lot of accidents and kids died. So naturally, the government came up with rules. There was a great outcry about public safety, and the government came up with rules. Every kid has to have a seat belt. Well, you can't fit 4 kids in the back seat of the car, and they each have seat belts. Only 3 kids are going to fit in the back seat of the car. So that means once you get to 4 kids, you got to buy a bigger car to transport all these kids in. So suddenly you have some very practical increase in costs. We're increasing the complexity of public safety, which seems to be good on the surface. We're trying to save the lives of kids, but in the process, we're increasing the cost of parenthood because now you've got to have a bigger car to accommodate a bigger family. And that is a practical pressure to reduce the number of children you're going to have because you can't fit them all in the same car. Now, if you want to have 4 or 5 kids, you've got to have a minivan, which is a more expensive car than a sedan. And you not just seatbelts, the kids need to have the right car seat. Kids by law have to be sitting in a car seat, and it has to be the right kind of car seat. So you've got to invest in car seats. So if you want a big family today, you got to have a minivan, you got to have car seats. And there are all sorts of other regulations that you have to follow when raising your kids that people didn't have to follow 50 years ago because these laws didn't exist. Now, the laws were all created for good reason. Complexity is always created for a good reason. There was a problem. Kids were dying in auto accidents. And there was a solution. And the solution was a new law that requires seatbelts and proper child seats in every car. But this is increasing the cost of parenthood, and it just means that people, when they have kids, they're going to stop at 2. They're not going to go to 4 or 5. They're going to stop at 2 because they realize that there is this increased cost involved in having children. And this sort of thing applies all over society. Everywhere you go, there are new regulations. It used to be that you could just get on a plane. You didn't need an ID. You just get on the plane. The plane would take you someplace. And it was actually pretty simple. You just arrive a few minutes before the flight and get on the plane. Then there were hijackings and there were bombings of planes. So we developed a security system. You had to run through security. And then we had 9/11, which showed that our security was weak. So we created even more bureaucracy to handle airport security. And now getting to the airport is a very complicated and costly thing. Can't just go to the airport and get on the plane. You have to get to the airport an hour ahead so you can go through security, and you have to have the proper ID. And it's suddenly it's become a complicated thing. There's actual costs that appear on your ticket. There's when you buy a plane ticket, there are actual costs built in which are paying for the security. But air travel is now a more complicated thing. An hour-long flight might actually mean that you have to spend 3 hours in transit to get to the airport and to get through security and all of that. So it has raised the cost of air travel. And everywhere you look, there's greater and greater complexity. We all depend on the internet. And this is an extremely complicated system. It's an extremely vulnerable system because people can attack the internet and essentially bring down our society. So that's another source of complexity in our life. And complexity has various costs. One of them is just the cost of obeying the regulations, the cost of regulatory compliance with the new regulations and the new structure. So a company can't do business the way it used to. It has to hire new employees simply to keep up with regulation and make sure they're obeying all the regulations. So that's raising the cost of doing business in whatever your field may be. Complex systems are also less resilient than simple systems, in that when you have a lot of regulation, you have a lot of structure, it's very difficult to change that structure. We can argue in the United States that we have an enormously complex structure, and now it's virtually impossible to change. Change requires, let's say, changes to federal law require action of Congress, and Congress isn't taking any action. Congress has taken very little action in the past decade. And part of this is because regulations are so complex that changes are very difficult. You can't make a small change in a complex system without affecting the entire system. So it gets to the point where you've got a problem. The legislators pass a law to try to fix the problem, and it just creates more problems because you already have a complex system, so you don't know what the effects of these changes are going to be. And what we have, in effect, is a a crippled society, a society that can no longer change with the times because the rules have just gotten so complex. So what does this all mean for us? It means that, well, we're doomed, that sooner or later our society will collapse. What collapse means is it will reduce itself to a much simpler state and have to start over. I can't tell you in advance what this collapse will look like. I only know that societies just get more and more complex until the complexity cripples them and becomes too costly, and one way or another they collapse. You can't predict how they're going to collapse. You can't predict the thing that's going to set off the collapse, but you can predict that a collapse will happen. What happened when the Soviet Union collapsed? Well, again, its bureaucracy killed it. Its bureaucracy became so unwieldy that it couldn't change with the times, and eventually the bureaucracy collapsed. This doesn't mean that the Russian people ceased to exist. They still remained alive, but the structure around them became very chaotic for a while until Vladimir Putin came along to reassert authoritarian control. That doesn't mean that Russia is out of the woods, because Russian society, the Russian economy, has its own problems that will lead perhaps to a second collapse. The one thing about collapse is that it isn't pleasant when it happens. It leads to a period of chaos and a period of instability, but it does leave the door open to some future society. Even though the Roman Empire collapsed, it could be said that it opened the way to medieval Europe, to eventually to the Renaissance, to an even better society than Rome's. It's just that the original structure collapses and that you have a period of instability before a new structure arises. Complexity is an addiction because it's always entered into for good reasons. When you create a new law, you're creating it for a good reason, to save lives or to protect a certain abused minority. And it's hard to argue with the creation of a new regulation. And in the beginning, the regulation has a positive effect. Regulations do tend to address the underlying problem that you are trying to address. But as time goes on, these regulations become less and less effective, so that you're passing a law to try to fix something, but because you already have so much complexity, you're actually breaking something else, which is causing as much damage as whatever you were trying to fix. This could be called the law of diminishing returns. As you create more regulations, create more complexity, you're getting less bang for your buck. And this can be seen in science. Let's say 100 years ago, there were a lot of great scientific advances made by individuals, like Albert Einstein and Charles Darwin. There were these single people who made great scientific breakthroughs on their own. And what they were doing is they were picking off the low-hanging fruit of science. They were picking off the relatively easy stuff. Science today is a big undertaking. If you're researching a new medicine, it's not just one guy researching the medicine. It is a whole multi-million-dollar project to try to bring this medicine to market. And when you do bring it to market, the benefits are relatively little compared to the huge costs that went into this advance. Arguably, the greatest medical advance of the 20th century was penicillin, which was invented by a relatively small group of people. Now, if you were to invent a new antibiotic, it involves hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, and millions of dollars to bring this thing to market. And that's because science in its early days picked off the easy stuff, and now we're left with the hard stuff. Now we're stuck with a paradoxical effect that I've talked about earlier, which is that medical science, although it's advancing every year, it is not improving human longevity. Because although the advances are coming, they're coming a lot more slowly, and there's much greater cost to each advance. So we've got a society that is so dependent on technology and so dependent on systems that you and I just don't understand. No one really understands the economy these days. No one fully understands why we have negative interest rates and why there's no inflation in the economy and why the actions of the Federal Reserve aren't working, that's because our economy has become so complex. There are so many different facets of our society that no one has a handle on, that no one can regulate, because we've invented derivatives, we've invented all sorts of exotic financial instruments that no one really understands, so no one can regulate. So complexity creates these bombs, these kind of time bombs, and we don't know where they're going to explode because society has become so complex that we can't predict how these systems are going to behave when under stress. It's like the fall of Rome all over again. I know that's kind of cliched, but we're sitting on a time bomb. We're sitting on a complexity time bomb, if nothing else. That society is getting more and more complex every year. There's more and more systems. There are more and more regulations. And this only gets more complicated over time until something happens which breaks the system and everything collapses all at once.